There's something in your father's will you were never supposed to see, the attorney whispered to Eleanor Whitman as the organ music faded inside St. Matthew's Chapel. The words settled over her like a second layer of black fabric, heavier than the wool coat she wore despite the mild October afternoon in Boston. The funeral had been dignified, restrained, exactly the way her father would have wanted it. Rows of white lilies framed the altar. Old colleagues from the insurance firm stood in dark suits, speaking in hushed voices about market forecasts and retirement plans, as if the world had not just shifted. Eleanor stood near the polished mahogany casket, her gloved hands folded neatly, her posture straight. At 68, she had long ago learned that composure was a kind of armor. Her father had raised her that way, never loud, never dramatic, always steady. She had expected grief today. She had prepared herself for the hollow ache of final goodbyes. What she had not prepared for was the look on the attorney's face. Harold Benton had handled her family's legal affairs for nearly 3 decades. He was not a man prone to theatrics. Yet as he adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses and leaned closer, there was something unsettled in his expression. A codicil was filed 3 weeks ago, he said quietly. Your brother and his wife were present. Eleanor's gaze drifted across the chapel to where her younger brother, Michael Whitman, stood beside his wife, Caroline. Michael's shoulders were slightly hunched, as if the weight of the day pressed more heavily on him than on anyone else. Caroline, by contrast, looked immaculate and composed in a tailored black dress, her blonde hair pinned perfectly in place. She was speaking softly to a distant cousin, one hand resting lightly on Michael's arm, her expression sympathetic, controlled. If there were nerves beneath that surface, they did not show. 3 weeks ago, Eleanor repeated silently. 3 weeks ago, her father had been in the hospital recovering from pneumonia. She remembered the antiseptic smell of the room, the thin hospital blanket pulled up to his chest, the way his once commanding voice had softened but never lost its clarity. He had squeezed her hand and said, Everything's in order, Ellie. Don't you worry. She had believed him. The service concluded with a final hymn. Guests began to file out toward the reception hall across the courtyard, their heels clicking against the stone walkway. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. Eleanor remained by the casket a moment longer, studying her father's face, peaceful and still. She felt the familiar pull of memory, Sunday dinners, long drives along the Cape when she was a child, his steady hands guiding the steering wheel. He had always been deliberate, careful. He did not make sudden changes. When she finally stepped outside, Caroline intercepted her with a gentle, almost rehearsed smile. It was a beautiful service, she said softly. Your father would have approved. Eleanor nodded. He liked things orderly. Caroline's eyes flickered for just a fraction of a second. Yes, she replied. He wanted everything to be fair. The word lingered between them. Fair. It sounded harmless enough, even virtuous. But something in Caroline's tone made it feel measured, like a term already defined elsewhere. Across the courtyard, Harold Benton stood waiting, a leather folder tucked beneath his arm. Michael avoided Eleanor's gaze as he joined them, clearing his throat and adjusting his tie. The 4 of them moved toward a private conference room inside the parish office, away from the low murmur of extended family and catered trays of coffee and pastries. As Eleanor walked, the rhythm of her heels against the tiled floor echoed more loudly than usual. She had the distinct sensation that this day, which should have marked an ending, was instead the beginning of something she had not anticipated. Grief, she could manage. Loss, she understood. But secrecy was something else entirely. And as the heavy wooden door closed behind them, Eleanor realized that whatever had been added to her father's will 3 weeks ago was not just a legal adjustment. It was a decision. One made quietly, one made without her. The parish conference room was smaller than Eleanor expected, with beige walls and a narrow window that overlooked the church parking lot, where sedans and black town cars sat in neat rows under the gray afternoon sky. A long oak table filled most of the space. Harold Benton placed his leather folder carefully at the center, smoothing the edge as if aligning papers could steady the air in the room. Michael pulled out a chair, but did not sit immediately. Caroline took her seat first, crossing her ankles with precise elegance, her expression attentive, almost serene. Eleanor lowered herself into the chair opposite them, folding her hands on the table just as she had done beside her father's casket. She felt the faint hum of the building's heating system and the distant murmur of guests gathering for the reception. Life was continuing in the next room. In here, something else was about to unfold. Harold cleared his throat. He explained that 3 weeks earlier, Mr. Whitman had requested a formal amendment to his will. The appointment had been scheduled through Michael. Eleanor listened without interrupting, her face composed, her breathing even. She remembered visiting her father at the hospital during that same week. He had complained about the bland food and joked about escaping before Thanksgiving so he could carve the turkey himself. He had not mentioned paperwork. He had not mentioned any dissatisfaction. Harold opened the folder and removed a stapled document. The crisp sound of paper sliding across the table seemed louder than it should have been. He began to read in a steady, professional tone. The amendment stated that certain assets previously designated to be divided equally between his 2 children were to be reassigned. A majority share of the family home in Cambridge would pass directly to Michael. The investment account that Eleanor had helped her father manage over the past decade would also be transferred under Michael's oversight. A clause referenced considerations of fairness and recent involvement in day-to-day affairs. Eleanor's gaze shifted briefly toward her brother. Michael kept his eyes fixed on the tabletop, his jaw tight. Caroline, however, looked directly at Harold, nodding subtly, as if confirming familiar details. Fairness again. The word echoed in Eleanor's mind. She recalled conversations over the past year when Caroline had gently suggested that Michael bore more responsibility because he lived only 20 minutes away while Eleanor resided nearly 90 miles outside the city. It was true that Eleanor had moved after her husband passed away, seeking quiet in a small coastal town. But she had still driven into Boston every other weekend. She had balanced her father's accounts online, reviewed statements, ensured that bills were paid on time. Responsibility had never been a competition. Harold continued reading. The effective date was stamped clearly. 3 weeks ago. The same week, Eleanor had noticed a subtle change in her father's voice during their evening calls. He had sounded tired, yes, but not confused. Not uncertain. He had asked about her garden, about whether the hydrangeas had survived the early frost. He had not spoken like a man reconsidering his legacy. When Harold finished, silence settled over the room. It was not explosive. It was measured. Eleanor placed her palms flat against the table, feeling the smooth varnish beneath her fingertips. She did not accuse. She did not question immediately. Instead, she asked in a calm, level tone whether her father had appeared well during the signing. Harold hesitated. He replied that Mr. Whitman had been recovering but lucid. The witnesses listed included a notary and an acquaintance of Caroline's who had assisted with scheduling. At the mention of the acquaintance, Eleanor felt something shift, not outwardly but internally, like a quiet alignment of suspicion and memory. She remembered arriving at the hospital one afternoon and finding Caroline already there, standing by the window with a folder tucked under her arm. Caroline had smiled warmly and said she was simply helping organize discharge paperwork. At the time, Eleanor had been grateful. Now, the recollection carried a different weight. Michael finally spoke, his voice low. He said that their father wanted matters simplified. He said that it was practical. Caroline added softly that sometimes difficult decisions were made for the good of everyone involved. Eleanor studied them both, noticing the slight tremor in Michael's hand as it rested on the table. Outside, a car door slammed in the parking lot, sharp and ordinary. Inside, Eleanor understood that the amendment was not merely about property. It was about influence. It was about who had stood closest during the final weeks and who had guided the pen across the page. And for the first time since the service began, her grief began to give way to something steadier, sharper, and far more deliberate. Caroline was the first to stand, smoothing the front of her dress, as if concluding a routine business meeting rather than a conversation that had quietly redrawn the lines of inheritance. She suggested they return to the reception before relatives began to speculate. Michael nodded quickly, almost gratefully, and reached for the door. Eleanor remained seated for a moment longer, her eyes resting on the document that lay between them. She did not touch it. She simply memorized what she could from where she sat. The date, the margin spacing, the unfamiliar firmness of the signature line. Her father had always signed his name with a slight upward curve at the end, a subtle lift that felt optimistic. From across the table, the final stroke looked flatter. It might have meant nothing. It might have meant everything. When she finally rose, she thanked Harold in an even tone and asked for a certified copy to be sent to her home address. He agreed without hesitation, though his gaze lingered on her face as if searching for signs of outrage. There were none. The hallway outside felt brighter than before. Laughter drifted faintly from the reception room, where coffee was being poured and paper plates carried small sandwiches cut into careful triangles. Life, once again, appeared orderly. Caroline slipped her hand through Michael's arm and guided him forward. Eleanor followed at a measured pace, observing rather than participating. At the reception table, an elderly neighbor approached her with gentle condolences, recalling how her father had shoveled snow from driveways well into his 70s, refusing payment. Eleanor smiled politely, thanking her, accepting the warm squeeze of a familiar hand. Across the room, she watched as Caroline spoke animatedly to a cluster of cousins, her posture confident, her tone sympathetic yet assured. She seemed entirely at ease. Michael remained close to his wife, responding when spoken to but offering little on his own. Eleanor noticed how often Caroline answered questions directed at him. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was consistent. A tray of coffee cups rattled softly as it was set down near the window. Eleanor moved toward it, pouring herself a small cup even though she did not intend to drink it. The simple action gave her a moment to think. 3 weeks ago, she replayed the timeline carefully. The hospital stay had lasted 9 days. During the first 4, she had visited every afternoon, staying until visiting hours ended at 8 o'clock. On the 5th day, she had driven back to the coast for a scheduled medical appointment of her own. That was the day Caroline had offered to sit with her father instead. Eleanor had thanked her then. She remembered the phone call that evening. Caroline had said he was resting comfortably and that the doctors were optimistic. She had also mentioned that some paperwork needed updating, routine matters, nothing urgent. Eleanor had not asked for details. She had trusted the simplicity of the explanation. Now, standing beside the coffee urn, she considered how carefully phrased those words had been. Routine matters. Nothing urgent. The language had been soothing, designed to close the subject. She turned slightly and saw Harold speaking with a distant relative near the doorway. He caught her eye briefly and gave a polite nod. There was something restrained in his expression, as if he too sensed an imbalance that could not yet be named. Eleanor placed the untouched cup on a nearby table and reached for her handbag. Inside was a small leather planner she carried everywhere. She flipped it open discreetly and scanned the week in question. There it was. A notation in her own handwriting. Doctor appointment, Tuesday, 2 p.m. hospital visit postponed. Beneath it, in smaller script, she had written called Dad in the evening. She closed the planner slowly. Across the room, Caroline laughed at something one of the cousins had said. The sound was light, almost musical. It did not match the gravity of the day. Eleanor studied her sister-in-law's face, the precise calm of her movements, the assurance with which she occupied the center of the room. Grief affects everyone differently, she reminded herself. Yet what unsettled her was not Caroline's composure. It was the timing. The amendment had not been filed months ago when her father was healthy and clear-headed. It had been executed during a narrow window when access was limited and influence mattered most. Eleanor understood then that if there were answers to be found, they would not be discovered in raised voices or public confrontation. They would be found in dates, signatures, hospital logs, and quiet conversations. And as the reception carried on around her with polite smiles and clinking cups, she made a silent decision not to challenge anyone that afternoon, but to begin asking questions no one else yet realized she was prepared to ask. The reception gradually thinned as relatives drifted back to their cars, and the late afternoon light stretched long across the church courtyard. Eleanor waited until the last of the distant cousins had offered their condolences before she retrieved her coat and stepped outside. The air carried a sharper chill now, the kind that settled into the bones and lingered. She watched as Michael and Caroline stood near their dark blue sedan, speaking in low voices. When Michael noticed her approaching, he straightened and offered a tentative smile that did not reach his eyes. Caroline's expression shifted more quickly, settling into polite concern. Eleanor did not confront them about the amendment. Not yet. Instead, she asked Michael a simple question about their father's final week in the hospital. Her tone was steady, almost conversational. Michael hesitated before answering. saying that their father had seemed clear-minded, even determined to take care of unfinished matters. Caroline added that it had been important for him to feel useful, to feel in control. Eleanor listened carefully, noting not only what they said but how they said it. Michael's words came slowly, as though he were recalling a script. Caroline's explanation arrived smoothly, filling any silence before it could deepen. Eleanor asked who had contacted Harold Benton to schedule the signing. Michael glanced briefly at his wife before replying that he had made the call, but that Caroline had coordinated the details because she was better with paperwork. The statement hung in the air. Eleanor nodded, as if satisfied. She thanked them for being present during those hospital days, when she could not be there every hour. Caroline responded with a gentle touch to Eleanor's arm, saying that family must support one another. The gesture felt carefully measured, neither too warm nor too distant. Eleanor observed that the hospital required identification for visitors after 7 in the evening. She mentioned it lightly, almost as an aside. Caroline replied that she had handled the check-in desk several times and that the nurses had been accommodating. Michael confirmed this with a quick nod. Eleanor stored the information quietly. She had visited that same floor often enough to know the routines. Nothing improper about paperwork in a hospital room, she reminded herself. Yet the timing remained narrow, precise. As they parted, Michael promised to call in a few days to discuss next steps regarding the house. Caroline added that they should move forward quickly to avoid unnecessary complications. Eleanor agreed that clarity was important. She watched their car pull out of the lot, taillights glowing red before disappearing onto the main road. Only when they were gone did she allow her expression to change, not into anger, but into focus. That evening, back in her small coastal home 90 miles away, Eleanor placed her handbag on the kitchen counter and removed her planner once more. She spread it open beside her laptop and began reviewing old email confirmations from the hospital's patient portal. She noted the dates of her own visits and the gaps between them. She searched her inbox for any message referencing legal paperwork. There were none. She then navigated to the online banking statements she had previously monitored for her father. Access had already been restricted. A notification indicated that account permissions had been updated. The change had occurred on the same date listed on the amendment. Eleanor leaned back slowly in her chair. Outside her window, the Atlantic wind rattled bare tree branches against the siding. She did not interpret the account change as proof of wrongdoing. She interpreted it as a sequence. Appointment scheduled. Hospital visit managed. Amendment signed. Account access adjusted. Each step might be reasonable alone. Together, they formed a pattern. She opened a new folder on her desktop and labeled it simply with her father's initials. Into it, she began saving copies of every document she could still retrieve, every email, every statement, every timestamp. She worked methodically, the way she had once organized client files during her own career. There was no rush in her movements, no visible agitation, only structure. Before closing her laptop for the night, she drafted a brief email to Harold Benton requesting confirmation of the notary's name and contact information, along with the exact time the amendment had been executed. She read the message twice before sending it, ensuring the tone was neutral, almost administrative. When she finally turned off the kitchen light, the house fell into quiet darkness. Grief still lingered beneath the surface, but it no longer blurred her thoughts. In its place was something clearer, steadier. Eleanor understood that answers rarely announced themselves. They revealed themselves to those willing to look patiently and to compare what was said with what was recorded. And she intended to do exactly that. Harold Benton replied the next morning at 9:15 with a brief, professional email confirming that the amendment had been signed at 11:40 a.m. in room 614 of St. Andrew's Medical Center, notarized by a licensed mobile notary named Thomas Keller. Attached was a scanned copy of the notary acknowledgement page. Eleanor read the email twice before opening the attachment. The signature line was clear, dated precisely as stated. She noted the time again. 11:40 in the morning. She opened her planner and traced her finger across that same date. At 11:30 that morning, she had been sitting in a waiting room in Plymouth for her cardiology follow-up, nearly 50 miles from Boston. She remembered the muted television mounted on the wall, the scent of disinfectant, the nurse calling her name at 11:38. If the signing occurred at 11:40, Then Caroline would have been alone with her father when the notary arrived, except for hospital staff. Eleanor did not assume wrongdoing. She assumed proximity. She searched online for Thomas Keller and found a listing for a mobile notary service operating throughout Suffolk County. His website stated that he specialized in hospital signings and urgent legal documents. Eleanor picked up the phone and called the number listed, introducing herself calmly and explaining that she was reviewing estate documents for accuracy. When Mr. Keller answered, his voice was courteous but cautious. He confirmed that he had been called to the hospital by a woman identifying herself as the patient's daughter-in-law. He recalled that the patient appeared tired but responsive, and that he had verified identification according to standard procedure. Eleanor asked whether the patient had read the document independently or whether it had been summarized. Mr. Keller paused before answering that the document had been presented by the family member, and that he had relied on her assurance that the patient understood its contents. Eleanor thanked him for his time and ended the call without accusation. She then opened her saved banking statements once more, focusing on the week surrounding the signing. A withdrawal of $75,000 had been processed 2 days after the amendment was filed. The memo line read administrative adjustment. The destination account was not one she recognized from her father's prior records. She clicked through archive correspondence and located an older email from her father in which he had mentioned maintaining a single primary investment account for simplicity. There had been no discussion of opening new accounts. Eleanor printed the statement and placed it in a manila folder on her kitchen table. She added a handwritten note in the margin indicating the date and time. Patterns required documentation. Documentation required clarity. Later that afternoon, she drove to Boston to visit St. Andrew's Medical Center. The lobby was bright with polished floors and soft instrumental music playing overhead. She approached the information desk and requested access to visitor logs for room 614 on the date in question, explaining that she was verifying estate matters. Hospital policy limited what could be disclosed, but after presenting identification and proof of her relationship, she was permitted to confirm general visitation times. The record indicated that Caroline had checked in at 10:15 a.m. and that a notary service had been logged at 11:35. Eleanor absorbed the details without outward reaction. The timing aligned precisely with the email. As she walked back to her car in the parking garage, she considered the sequence once more. Caroline had arranged the appointment, coordinated the notary, remained present during the signing, and 2 days later, funds had shifted. None of these facts alone constituted misconduct. Together, they suggested orchestration. Eleanor sat behind the steering wheel for several minutes before starting the engine. She was not interested in confrontation fueled by suspicion. She was interested in evidence that could withstand scrutiny. Back at her coastal home that evening, she drafted a formal letter to Harold Benton requesting a full accounting of all financial movements within 30 days of the amendment. Her language was precise and measured, free of emotion. She attached copies of the statements she had printed and referenced the visitor log confirmation from the hospital. When she sealed the envelope, she did so carefully, pressing the adhesive flat with the side of her hand. Outside, the tide rolled steadily against the shoreline, indifferent to family disputes and legal amendments. Eleanor stood at her kitchen window, watching the distant beam of the lighthouse sweep across the dark water at regular intervals. Grief had not left her, but it no longer guided her decisions. Facts did, and with each documented detail, the space between assumption and proof began to narrow. 3 days after mailing her formal request, Eleanor received a call from Harold Benton asking if she could come into his downtown office to review preliminary findings in person. His tone was measured, but there was a weight beneath it that confirmed her instincts had not been misplaced. She drove into Boston early, leaving before sunrise so she would arrive ahead of the morning traffic. The city was just waking when she parked on State Street, the glass towers reflecting pale light across the harbor. Harold's office occupied the 6th floor of a historic brick building that overlooked the financial district. Inside, the reception area smelled faintly of polished wood and fresh coffee. Eleanor was shown into a private conference room similar to the one at the parish, though this one felt more formal, lined with shelves of legal volumes. Harold entered carrying a thicker folder than before. He closed the door carefully behind him and took a seat across from her. He explained that in response to her request, He had initiated a review of account transfers and authorization forms submitted during the final month of her father's life. The $75,000 withdrawal had been transferred into a newly established joint account listing Michael Whitman and Caroline Whitman as co-holders. The authorization form bore her father's signature, dated the same day as the amendment. Eleanor listened without interruption, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the table. Harold continued, noting that while it was not uncommon for elderly clients to consolidate funds with a child for convenience, the timing in this instance was compressed. The amendment, the new joint account, and the withdrawal had all occurred within a 48-hour window. He slid copies of the documents toward her. The signature on the bank authorization appeared similar to the one on the amendment, yet slightly uneven, as though the pen had been pressed more firmly at the beginning and lighter at the end. Eleanor traced the air just above the ink without touching the paper. She asked whether the bank required in-person verification for new joint accounts. Harold replied that policies varied, but typically identification and consent were confirmed directly. He had already contacted the branch manager to request confirmation of procedure. There was another detail, he added quietly. The hospital records indicated that on the morning of the signing, her father had been administered a higher dosage of prescribed medication to manage discomfort. The dosage was within legal limits, but it was noted in the chart that he had been drowsy shortly before noon. Eleanor absorbed this information with steady composure. She did not react with alarm. She asked instead whether the notary had documented any concerns regarding capacity. Harold answered that the notary's statement declared the signer appeared aware and voluntary, but there was no detailed assessment beyond that standard language. A silence followed, heavy but controlled. Outside the window, traffic moved along. The street below in orderly lanes, unaware of the quiet unraveling inside the office. Eleanor finally spoke, her voice calm. She said that she did not wish to accuse her brother of deliberate harm without clear evidence, but she could not ignore the sequence of events. She asked Harold what options existed to formally review the amendment's validity based on capacity at the time of signing. Harold explained that a petition could be filed in probate court requesting evaluation of the circumstances under which the documents were executed. Medical testimony and financial timelines would be examined. It would not be a public spectacle, but it would require transparency from all parties involved. Eleanor nodded slowly. She requested that Harold begin preparing the necessary paperwork. Not to create conflict, she clarified, but to ensure that their father's intentions were accurately represented. As she left the office later that morning, the city was fully awake, pedestrians crossing intersections with purpose, taxis inching through traffic. Eleanor walked toward her car with measured steps. The facts were no longer abstract suspicions. They were documented timelines, medication records, and financial transfers aligned too precisely to dismiss. Grief had given way to resolve, and resolve now had structure. Whatever had been set in motion within that hospital room would be examined under clear light, not through raised voices, but through records, signatures, and sworn statements. And Eleanor was prepared for that examination. The formal notice was delivered by certified mail 5 days later. Michael called that evening, his voice tight, asking what exactly Eleanor thought she was doing. She had expected the call. She answered calmly, telling him that a petition for review had been filed to clarify the circumstances surrounding the amendment and the joint account transfer. She emphasized that the process was procedural, not personal. On the other end of the line, there was a pause long enough for her to hear his unsteady breathing. He said that Caroline was upset, that she felt accused of something improper. Eleanor replied that transparency would protect everyone involved. If their father had fully intended those changes, then documentation would confirm it. If not, then correction would be necessary. She did not raise her voice. She did not assign blame. She simply stated that facts deserved examination. 2 days later, they met at Harold Bennon's office for a preliminary discussion before the probate hearing. Michael arrived first, pacing near the window with restless energy. Caroline entered moments later, composed as always, though her movements were sharper than usual. Eleanor took her seat across from them, placing a thin folder on the table containing copies of the hospital medication chart and the bank transfer timeline. Harold began by outlining the purpose of the petition. It was not to accuse, but to assess capacity and intent at the time of signing. Caroline responded quickly, saying that their father had been clear and grateful that someone was helping manage his affairs. She stated that the new account was created only to simplify bill payments and that the funds had not been spent recklessly. Eleanor listened, her expression neutral. When Harold invited questions, she asked one. She asked whether the $75,000 remained intact in the joint account. Caroline hesitated for the first time. She answered that a portion had been used for estate-related expenses, including advance payments for funeral arrangements and outstanding medical bills. Eleanor nodded slowly. She asked for documentation of those payments. Michael shifted in his chair, rubbing his hands together. He said that this felt unnecessary, that their father trusted them. Eleanor met his gaze steadily and replied that trust was not in question, clarity was. Harold then introduced the hospital medication record, noting the higher dosage administered that morning. Caroline's composure faltered briefly. She insisted that the dosage was standard and that the notary had confirmed awareness. Eleanor responded quietly that standard does not always mean optimal for legal decisions. The room grew still. Outside the window, traffic moved steadily through the afternoon streets. No raised voices filled the space. No dramatic accusations were made. Instead, each statement was weighed and recorded. Harold explained that the probate court would review medical testimony and determine whether the amendment reflected informed consent. If doubt existed, the document could be invalidated. Caroline's tone shifted from confident to defensive. She said that she had only been trying to help, that Michael was overwhelmed, that someone had to take initiative. Eleanor acknowledged that initiative could be helpful, but only when aligned with the documented wishes of the person whose name appeared on the signature line. Michael finally spoke with visible strain. He admitted that Caroline had encouraged the changes, suggesting that it would prevent future disputes. He said that their father had seemed agreeable but tired. The word tired settled heavily in the room. Eleanor did not seize on it. She simply asked whether their father had been given time alone with the notary. Michael glanced toward Caroline before answering that he was not certain. Harold made a note. The meeting concluded without resolution, but something fundamental had shifted. The narrative of smooth fairness had fractured under careful questioning. As they stood to leave, Caroline avoided Eleanor's eyes for the first time. Michael lingered as though wanting to say more, but he remained silent. Eleanor gathered her folder and walked out into the corridor with measured steps. She did not feel victorious. She felt steady. The process was no longer private speculation. It was now a structured review supported by dates, dosages, signatures, and transfers. And for the first time since the funeral, the balance of certainty had begun to tilt. The probate hearing was scheduled for a clear Tuesday morning 3 weeks later in Suffolk County Probate Court. Eleanor arrived early, dressed in a simple navy suit, carrying the same organized folder she had been building since the afternoon of the funeral. The courtroom was modest, with wooden benches polished smooth from years of quiet proceedings. There were no cameras, no raised voices, only the low murmur of attorneys reviewing notes. Michael and Caroline entered together but did not sit beside Eleanor. Caroline's posture remained straight, her expression composed, yet there was a tightness around her eyes that had not been there before. When the judge took the bench, the room settled into stillness. Harold presented the timeline first, methodically outlining the amendment, the hospital medication record, the creation of the joint account, and the transfer of funds within 48 hours. He emphasized that the petition did not allege malicious intent, but questioned whether informed consent had been fully established. Caroline's attorney responded by highlighting the notary's statement and asserting that Mr. Whitman had appeared lucid and cooperative. The judge listened without interruption, occasionally glancing at the medical chart. A hospital physician was called to provide clarification regarding the dosage administered that morning. The physician explained that while the medication was within acceptable limits, it could cause drowsiness and reduced concentration in elderly patients. He stated that cognitive clarity varies and that assessment of capacity requires careful observation. Eleanor watched as the judge took notes, her expression unchanged. Then the notary, Thomas Keller, was asked to describe the signing. He testified that he had been introduced by Caroline, that Mr. Whitman had answered basic identification questions correctly, and that the document had been summarized rather than read in full. When asked whether the patient had been left alone with him to confirm independent intent, He admitted that Caroline had remained in the room throughout the process. The admission hung in the quiet courtroom. Caroline shifted slightly in her seat. Michael stared down at his hands. The judge requested the bank records next. The branch manager's written statement confirmed that the joint account had been opened based on paperwork delivered by Caroline and Michael, with Mr. Whitman's signature verified against existing records, but without an in-person appearance at the branch. Eleanor felt no surge of triumph. She felt only a steady awareness that the pattern she had observed was now visible to others. After reviewing the evidence, the judge spoke calmly. She stated that while there was no conclusive proof of deliberate coercion, the compressed timeline, combined with medication effects and lack of independent consultation, created sufficient doubt regarding the amendment's validity. Pending further review, the amendment and associated transfer would be suspended, and the estate would revert temporarily to the prior will structure. The joint account funds were to remain frozen until a final determination. The decision was procedural, not punitive, yet its impact was immediate. Caroline's composure faltered for the first time. She leaned toward her attorney, whispering urgently. Michael looked toward Eleanor, his expression a mixture of confusion and dawning realization. As the session concluded, Eleanor gathered her folder and stood. She did not look at Caroline with accusation. She did not address Michael with blame. Instead, she acknowledged Harold with a quiet nod and walked toward the exit. In the hallway outside the courtroom, the fluorescent lights hummed softly overhead. Michael stepped forward as if to speak, then hesitated. Eleanor paused long enough to meet his eyes. She told him that whatever the court ultimately decided, their father's intentions deserved clarity, not convenience. Michael's shoulders lowered slightly, as though a weight he had not fully understood was beginning to shift. Caroline remained several steps behind, silent for once. Eleanor continued down the corridor with measured steps, aware that the balance had changed. The narrative of quiet fairness had been replaced by documented scrutiny. And in that measured, orderly courtroom, the secret that had once been shielded by timing and access was now standing in open light. The final review was completed 6 weeks later, and the court's written determination arrived by certified mail on a quiet Friday afternoon. Eleanor sat at her kitchen table overlooking the gray Atlantic, the envelope resting unopened beside her cup of tea for several minutes before she slid a letter opener beneath the seal. The ruling was clear and deliberate in its language. Based on medical testimony, timing, and the absence of independent consultation, the amendment executed in the hospital room was deemed invalid. The original will, signed 5 years earlier when her father had been in full health, would stand as the governing document of the estate. The joint account created during the disputed period was ordered dissolved, and the transferred funds were to be returned to the estate for proper distribution under the original terms. Eleanor read every line twice, not searching for celebration but for confirmation. There was no dramatic flourish in the wording, no condemnation, only correction. Later that week, the funds were restored and the estate settled according to the earlier structure, dividing assets evenly between her and Michael. The Cambridge home was to be sold, with proceeds shared. The investment account would return to its previous designation. Eleanor did not contact Michael immediately. She waited until he called her. When he did, his voice carried a different tone than before. The sharp defensiveness had faded, replaced by something quieter. He admitted that he had allowed convenience and reassurance to guide him rather than careful reflection. He said that Caroline had believed she was protecting their interests, but that neither of them had fully considered how the timing might appear or what their father's diminished strength might have meant in that moment. Eleanor listened without interruption. She did not demand apologies. She told him that intentions do not erase consequences, but clarity allows repair. A week later, they met at the Cambridge house to begin sorting through their father's belongings before listing the property. The late autumn air was cool, and fallen leaves gathered along the front steps where they had once sat as children on summer evenings. Inside, the rooms felt smaller than Eleanor remembered. Sunlight filtered through familiar curtains, illuminating shelves of books and framed photographs. Michael moved more slowly now, handling items with care rather than haste. Caroline was present but quieter, offering logistical suggestions rather than direction. There was no confrontation, no raised voices. Only the subdued rhythm of sorting memories into boxes labeled keep, donate, archive. At one point, Eleanor paused in her father's study, running her fingers along the edge of his old oak desk. She remembered how steady his signature had once been, how deliberate his decisions had always felt. The court ruling had restored legal balance, but what it had truly restored was the integrity of that steadiness. As the house emptied over the following days, Eleanor felt a shift not in power, but in understanding. The secret that had nearly altered everything was not buried again. It remained acknowledged, examined, and corrected. When the sale closed and the estate was finalized, Eleanor returned to her coastal home with a quiet sense of completion. She did not view the outcome as victory over Caroline or triumph over her brother. She viewed it as alignment with the truth of her father's long-standing intentions. On a calm evening, she stood by her kitchen window watching the lighthouse beams sweep across the water in slow, steady intervals. The tide moved in and out without urgency, indifferent to disputes and documents. Eleanor understood that families are not undone by questions. They are undone by silence. By choosing documentation over accusation, patience over impulse, she had preserved not only her rightful inheritance but the dignity of her father's final chapter. And in that quiet house by the sea, with the wind pressing gently against the glass, she allowed herself to feel something deeper than relief. She felt certainty that when secrets are brought into open light, they lose their power to divide, and what remains is the calm strength of facts, steady and unshaken.